Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a una sesión más del Seminario Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas. It's a pleasure today to have here at Colegio de México Demetrios Papademetriou. Welcome to Mexico City, to Colegio.
Thank you very much. It has been my pleasure. This has been a terrific event.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. In the seminar, we're really interested about migration, inequality, and public policy. And you've been the head of a very important policy institute, the Migration Policy Institute, for many years. You're currently a distinguished senior fellow, co-founder, the professor, president emeritus of the Migration Policy Institute. You're the president of Migration Policy Institute at Europe. And I think, I guess it's really interesting for us to locate migration, inequality, and public policy, immigration policy specifically, in a time when there's a lot of discussions about the migration crisis, in quotes, I would say. I guess my first question would be, to what extent are we living in a crisis, immigration crisis? Is this new or not? And what are the characteristics of these so-called migration crisis?
Well, we certainly have had an unusual year or two. About 2 years ago, this was a migration crisis, in Europe in particular. But crisis doesn't necessarily refer to some sort of a constantly growing number of people who come in a very unregulated, chaotic way to our countries. In one sense, a crisis is also a state of mind.
Okay.
And I think that the state of mind, or the perception, has been winning over the reality over the last couple of years. Yes, numbers of people who have been coming, in a sense, in an unwanted way, particularly the most visible one, has been increasing. And that has created a sense in the United States that the border is out of control, which is, anything but the truth. And in the case of Europe, yes, again, that was a case, for about a 6 or 8 month period in 2015 and early 2016. But since then, you would say that whatever, objectively speaking, crisis there was, has been managed. And that for all of us analysts, but also politicians, the emphasis has shifted to a very large degree from immigration and how to stop the chaos and even reduce dramatically the numbers, to trying to make certain that the people who have come in can become integrated, that they can become, in the eyes of the public, as essentially people who will contribute rather than people who will only take, and that they become a successful member of their communities and societies.
And I guess what's really important then, you mentioned today in the conference that we had the differences between refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and so on. But I guess the status is key in order to have all these migrants arriving, have access to rights, but also to be able to work and to be, to not be undocumented or irregular, right?
Of course. And if you were to take any 100 people that have come to any place in Europe in the past 5 or 6 years, you would end up roughly with the following proportions. About between 40 and 45 or 50% of them would be what in the United States and in many other places we would call unauthorized immigrants. In Europe, you call these economic migrants. In other words, they come there because, and that's a perfectly rational response, because they want to actually have a better opportunity for themselves and their family. This is the reason for which people have been migrating since the beginning of migration thousands of years ago.
But I guess one of the differences, and I don't know if you agree, is that we tend to put a lot of focus on economic migrants, but we have shifted to a time where political context, political events, violence, even ethnic conflict and wars have, propitiated an increase of immigration.
So
right?
the other 55% fall into this category that can qualify for protected status. The protected status splits into two groups. The ones who are real refugees. In other words, they meet the international definition for a refugee. And then, and that's probably 35%, depending on where people came from. For the Syrians, it's going to be higher than that. For, some of the people who are coming from Africa, it's going to be lower than that. And then you have another 20-25% of people who are not really qualifying under the refugee definition or even the European definition for refugees, which is broader than the universal one, the Geneva Convention. But governments feel that if they were to be sent back, they would possibly suffer. And people who cannot be sent back, they don't qualify. They are not even qualified for this secondary protection. But you can't send them back because you don't have agreements with the countries of origin to take them back. And there's a cat and mouse game that takes place between, countries that want to send these people back and the countries of origin that say to Germany or to Greece or any other country, can you prove that this person is ours? Show me the proof. Is there a passport that says that this person is ours? So it is this cat and mouse sort of game that disturbs an awful lot of people, both in the policy community, but also in the governments.
But again, so migration management, many people say it's complicated, and governance, it's hard. You talked today about the challenges and solutions that are complicated, not only because there are different government interests, but also because sometimes the volume is hard to handle, to manage. We had a peak of flows arriving to places that had limited economic opportunities. Let's think of the case of Greece, Italy, right?
Yeah.
So there are responses that are somehow natural because it's hard to manage.
Indeed, and this is difficult to manage under any circumstances. Take the world's most generous and richest country. I don't want to argue the United States or China or anything like that, but let's take Germany. Amazing surpluses every year, a very generous society, an economy that is doing extremely well with lots of money to spare, okay? And they couldn't keep up with the demand, with the numbers. They kept falling further and further behind, and only now are they slowly coming out of the woods, as it were, in terms of being able to examine claims by people. And Europe, for better or worse, lives in a dangerous neighborhood. It's not just the Middle East, and the fact that you now have networks that have developed over the years of people from the Middle East who are coming to Europe. You also have North Africa, and the networks with North Africa go much, further back, longer period of time than with the Middle East. And increasingly you have networks that are developing from the rest of Africa, primarily the Horn, but also West Africa. So the challenge there, the governance challenge, is to do the right thing and at the same time to make sure that you send consistent messages to people who won't qualify, not to try. And that's, hard because unless you can demonstrate and move people back, and the Italians may be moving in that direction, make a quick decision who is not likely to qualify and return them. But in order to return someone, you have to have a place to which to return them. So these are difficult things. But migration management is also a state of mind. You have to believe that you need to manage migration, that borders do matter. They're not the answer, they are part of the answer. That interior enforcement is part of the answer, that removals is part of the answer, that integration, and if integration fails, is part of the answer, that choosing more of your immigrants rather than being chosen by whoever wants to come to Germany. I would want to go to Germany too, in a different stage of my life. That you have to choose more of the people who come. This way you can demonstrate to your public all the time that you are in charge of this issue. Yeah.
And I guess this brings back to something you mentioned and something we've actually discussed a lot in the seminar, the role of Canada, because it's sometimes considered as a role model in terms of selection policy, but also integration policy, right? And I guess, I know you would agree because you mentioned that, but how can Europe, as complex as it is as a region, move towards thinking about integration more broadly and in a more comprehensive way rather than just selection, which is
Right.
what immigration enforcement is looking at.
Well, I understand that you got part of your education in Canada, so
Yes.
you know a lot about Canada too. Canada is a demonstration of what I said earlier, a state of mind. They constantly demonstrate to their people that they're in control. That's why these few thousands of people who are coming from the United States is destabilizing that sense of control. The second thing that Canada does, it constantly brings its public along. Consultations, roundtables, groups, Sunday meetings, etc., constantly explaining to the Canadian system, to the Canadians, what the Canadian immigration system is about, how it is run, and what its purpose is. This way, you constantly keep support for the immigration system in Canada somewhere between 60 and 70%.
Yep.
And this is really something that cannot be copied, because most of the people, most of the governments want to bury migration issues, not just under the carpet, but in the basement. And they're not used. Policymakers only talk about migration when they have to somehow defend a policy or a non-policy, a failure. This is something that goes very deeply in how you organize your government and what its relationship is. It has to be completely interactive between your public and yourself. Ultimately, migration, the best migration systems are systems in which the government understands that they have to make policy on behalf of everyone. That's their responsibility. That's what they got elected for.
Yep.
And advocates emphasizing and advocating on behalf of a real small subset of the population. In the interaction between these two, you end up with better immigration policy and better protection of individuals than you would under any other scenario. And Canada does this very well. But when we say Canada, we really mean the English-speaking countries, because all of the experimentation in terms of governance and policy first happens in New Zealand, a tiny country that can test ideas. Australia then looks at them for a year or two or three and says, that's a decent idea. So they bring it to Australia, they rework it, they have success. Canada is looking at both of these and say, you know what, I should really try to see how I can incorporate, how I can indigenize, not to copy, how do I make it my own under the circumstances of what I know the Canadians want and what we are capable as government to do. And that is the success of Canada and a couple of the other countries. The United States doesn't do that, okay? Not by any stretch of the imagination. And probably will not. And Europe does not know how to do that. Okay? Not a single place in Europe really understands that constant interactive dynamic. And as a result, you're going to have this fit and starts, this unhappiness, then by overdoing something, etc., etc. Now, some countries within the EU, again, I hate to say Germany, but all the time, Germany, Sweden, some of the Nordic countries, and Austria, because they're much more organized societies, they're likely to have more success with how they do things than some of the other countries who have been discussing that they're not organized societies. That's all I will say.
But I guess what's interesting is that now that you are at MPI Europe, one of the roles of MPI is to produce research reports, provide facts and so on, but also to advise government officials, foundations, civil society. So I guess that maybe you can actually advise on how Europeans on how to integrate better.
I appreciate the fact that you know that there are two MPIs, meaning one that produces the reports that you see, and then another one that offers, I like to think of it as solving policy puzzles. We're called upon by governments at the senior most level saying, we got this problem, what are our options? What can we do, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, politics trumps everything. I am tired after having done this for far too many decades to hear politicians, whether they are American congressmen or senators or senior officials in the administration, or for that matter, ministers and deputy ministers and prime ministers over there saying, you know, Dimitri, you're right, but we can't do that. Okay? And my answer to this is, Minister, it's your choice whether to do it or not. But if you don't do this, you're going to be overwhelmed. And you're going to have problems in this area and that area and all that. So, yes, the advice function of the Migration Policy Institute is extremely important. We have had more influence than we allow ourselves to say, in the sense that we write cabinet papers for many, you know, countries that have opened up to immigration, review or write parts of immigration laws, etc., etc. But this is not something that you do and then it's going to be valid for the next 10 years.
No.
Migration requires active management. You constantly have to look for things that are not working the way that they're supposed to. And here is again the Canadian and Australian and New Zealand example. Longitudinal studies that basically look at immigrant groups and say, our policy expectations for starting this were that we were going to get those kinds of people and they were going to have this labor market or economic effect. And it doesn't seem to be working. In other words, if you think of it as a system, in a sense, the true nature, the magic of the system is in the feedback loop. The information that you take from complete and total and consistent examinations, and then it informs policy and you change policy. That's what I mean by active management. Nobody wants to do that.
Sometimes we don't have the data. No, I mean, I would say that, I guess, to highlight the fact that it's a process, right? I mean, we need to look at things over time, in a comparative perspective, how things are done differently in different contexts. And I guess also the fact that, I mean, you said today, well, we need to start thinking about the next crisis, right? So also looking ahead, not only looking at the past, what have we done, how do other people do different, but also what can happen next.
Yeah, and this is an area in which you folks in the academy, and us folks, at least as far as the Migration Policy Institute, you know, as a think tank of a very special nature, different than many of the other think tanks. That's where we have a special opportunity, because you as academics have an opportunity to sort of try to figure out what you want to write about and study next. And we, you know, in our kind of think tank, have enough support from foundations and others to basically say, okay, we're going to invest 80% or 90% of our efforts in analyzing what is happening here, et cetera, but we want to spend 10% of our time trying to figure out what's coming up next and start analyzing that. So when a crisis or a problem arises, we can say, here are your 3 options. And I wouldn't be in the think tank business if I did not have the liberty to do that. If the only thing I did is respond to things or do long studies, that was not going to be for me.
Yeah. I have a last question. We need to finish the discussion, unfortunately. But the seminar is on migration inequality. We're really interested in understanding different dimensions of migration and how they relate to inequality. And the idea is that policy, both immigration but also public policy in general, can reduce or increase inequality. So I guess in these discussions with governments and advising different officials, is inequality ever in the picture?
Increasingly.
Okay.
So, and inequality plays, of course, in many different aspects of the migration. If you're mistreating your immigrants, you know, if you bring them and force them to, by policy or implication, to work in the underground economy, they can undermine opportunities and wages of local population, the people who work side to side with them in the same work site, okay? And because you're taking advantage of them, you create, in a sense, you know, the lowest possible class of people, so you increase inequality. If you're treating people right, if they're there legal, or at least if you have provisions for starting people with temporary worker status, and then you help them transition, we call these bridging programs, to become permanent residents, and then they have rights, and they are capable and willing to defend those rights, then it has an opportunity to actually begin to reduce inequality. Now, if you're talking about inequality writ large, you know, I mean, if people are coming from one of the poorest places on earth, Haiti, just the fact that they're in the United States and work under any circumstances, including the underground economy, that, and if they send money back to Haiti, you could say that that reduces inequality in Haiti. So it's a complex picture.
Yep.
But it's a picture that only now, the last 3 or 4 years, people are beginning to pay attention to, and American foundations and governments, you know, are trying to think their way through that.
Well, that's very positive and optimistic on our side. And we started applying for funding, but also when we're starting to these discussions more in a more, I guess, ordered fashion. So thanks for ending on that positive note for the seminar. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Gracias a ustedes por estar en esta sesión del seminario. And it was a pleasure to have you here at El Colegio de México.
It is always a pleasure to come back to Mexico.
I hope you can come back.
Unfortunately, most of the time that I come to Mexico is to meet with government officials. But now that I remembered
academia,
how rich the conversations can be in the academy, I promise you I will.
Okay. Let us know when you're here.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos y los esperamos en una próxima sesión.